Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'd like to introduce you to the launch of School Board U, which is a new branding effort from VSBA. I hope that you are all here for the right reason. Tonight's program is preparing for the annual meeting, and specifically what we're going to focus on tonight is talking about presenting your budgets and tax implications of your budgets to your voters. And for some of you, I realize this is not at town meeting. What we're not going to talk about today is the state board's orders under Act 46 and the implications that those have for timing and some unanswered questions. As you probably are aware, there's a lot going on right now between the legislature and lawsuits that have implications for budgets and the annual meetings of school districts. And so we're just going to put that one aside. If you have questions about any of that, we encourage you to work with your superintendent and administration, and if necessary, consult your district's attorneys. Now that we've gotten through that part, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Susan Holson, the Director of Education Services at VSBA. I'm joined this evening by Carrie Lamb, our Director of Operations.
Good evening, everyone.
And Carrie is the mastermind for all our technology. If you are having any technical difficulties, you see the phone number for our office up at the top of the screen there. Please give Carrie a call if you are having any problems at all. In case you have not joined us for webinars in the past, let me just run through some quick logistics for you. I'm going to be projecting a PowerPoint presentation. I'll be talking a lot, but I want to make sure that we do have an opportunity to address all your questions. So I'm going to take some breaks throughout the content to specifically ask for questions, but feel free to raise them at any time. You should see a question box on your screen. Type in your questions. We do this because if everybody had open microphones, we'd have chaos. At the end of the webinar, you're going to get an evaluation form that pops up. It's a really quick thing. I think it's 3, maybe 4 questions. We really welcome your input. In fact, we encourage your input because it helps us get better. And within the next few days, early next week, we're going to follow up to each of you with a summary information of what we talked about tonight. We'll provide video of the PowerPoint with audio, and we'll also send you the deck of PowerPoint slides. And as we go through the evening, if we end up with any questions that we don't answer in real time, we will certainly send those and the answers out as well. Archives of our webinars are housed on our website at vtvsba.org. and also on the VSBA YouTube channel. If you're looking for them on our website, if you go to resources and click that button down at the bottom of the list, it says Web Archives. So if you're looking for topics that we're not discussing tonight, jump right over there. Are there any questions? Okay, let's move forward then. So what we're really talking about here is how you're going to present your budgets at your town meeting, or again, your district annual meetings. The first thing that we highly encourage is that you relate everything back to your goals. What are the district's goals for educating your students and being efficient? And how does the budget that you are preparing and proposing influence those goals? What progress have you made since last year that you might want to be continuing on? Have you identified new goals? What are they? And what kind of resources are you proposing dedicating to them? At the same time, we want to make sure that you provide your taxpayers with some metrics, and you should be working with your administration here to provide the most salient and the ones that make you look good. What opportunities for students have you accomplished? Are you working on? Have you improved? You can identify student outcomes here. Most many taxpayers have already probably seen your last round of test scores, so you might want to dig a little bit deeper in what it is you're choosing to show them. You want to show what kinds of efficiencies that you may have gained, and if it's relevant, the status of negotiated contracts. Of course, nobody would expect you to divulge where you are in an active negotiation. I don't think that would be really helpful to anybody. So, as I said at the beginning, we're going to really focus a lot on how to digest and present your budgets in terms of numbers, and especially the local tax implications and how it hits your taxpayers in their pockets. Some terms that we throw around pretty liberally here, but maybe worth even reviewing the definitions for your voters, is education spending, which the state defines as your budgeted expenses less any local revenue and state and federal grants. And when we as school board members are reviewing the budget information we're getting from the business office, we really tend to focus on the expense side. But don't forget that before you go to your voters with a tax bill, you are netting out those revenues. Another topic that's a big one is equalized pupils. And we understand that there is some active controversy or confusion right now around equalized pupils. Specifically, on January 11th, the Secretary of Education sent out a memo to business officers and superintendents identifying a glitch in this year's calculations of equalized pupils, because the statewide longitudinal data system that had been intended to be operational was having some bugs. It's not fully integrated yet, and that's really slowing things down and making things more complicated. I'm not going to dwell on any of the details tonight or any of the specifics, but just know that there are issues. As I said, your business managers and your superintendents are well-versed, should be well-versed in this, and I would suggest that you go to them for any input so that you are clear on what the issues might have been that may provide you with only temporary numbers that you're using as you're presenting tax rates. Another important item to define for taxpayers, and it's a really hard one to define, is the yield. The yield is it's an amount set by legislature, recommended by the Department of Taxes, to raise enough revenue to support the anticipated education spend for the state minus all the other revenues that come into the education fund. So it's a very complicated manipulation and calculation, and they come up with two different yields. The property dollar equivalent yield is that which relates to homestead taxes, and the income adjusted the income yield relates to income adjusted tax calculations, and we will talk a lot more about those things. And finally, the common level of appraisal is an attempt by the state to equalize the discrepancies in assessed values of properties on the grand list and the fair market value. So theoretically, we are all paying taxes on the fair market value of our properties. There are a few numbers to know specific for this year. The homestead property tax, which is the one you hear talked about most of the time, the base tax rate is fixed by statute now at $1, and that's why we have this yield that fluctuates. The estimated property value yield sorry, that's a typo, it's the property dollar yield this year is $10,666, which is up 4.3% from last year. And that is a factor by which the district spending per equalized pupil gets adjusted, and it gets adjusted again for the common level of appraisal. For income adjusted taxpayers, and we will again define that later, there's a statutory 2% of income as the base tax rate, and that also is adjusted by a yield, which is a different yield. This year, the projected yield is $13,104, which is up almost 6% from last year. And finally, set in statute is the tax rate for non-residential properties, which are, as you can see, generally taxed at a higher rate, although in some instances they actually are paying less than your local taxpayers, depending on your local spending decisions. And those numbers are established and circulated with a letter that, again, is required by statute. It is released on or before December 1st by the tax department to the legislature, who then has to finalize those numbers once they're in session. And that usually happens after town meeting day, making this a little tricky, but it's something that we have been dealing with for a number of years now. The rates set in that letter, the yields particularly, are presented to the governor, who passes them on to legislature. However, between the tax department and legislature, those things can change based on a variety of things. It can change based on the revenues that are coming in from other sources, and particularly, these are all based on an anticipated spend increase versus the previous year. And the December 1st letter of 2018 projected a 3.25 perhaps increase in statewide education spending for fiscal 2020, which is the year beginning July 1st, 2019. If in fact we collectively present budgets to the agency of education that turn out to be less of an increase, then those yields will be adjusted accordingly. And that is, of course, what happened last year, when the projection was, again, about a 3% growth rate, and school boards brought it in well under that. And finally, I think it's helpful, or you may find it helpful, to have comparisons for the average statewide, again, estimated tax rates, so that you have something to compare your own projections to present to your voters. And that's discretionary. If it's something that tells a good story, you're going to use it. And if it's something that doesn't really support your budget, you may choose not to use it. But just so you know, again, based on the projections in the December 1st letter, the homestead property tax statewide is likely to remain at $1.50. The estimated income adjusted rate looks like it's going to come down a little bit from FY19, from 2.49 to 2.45% of income, and the non-residential rate will remain the same. Okay, lots of stuff there. Are there questions about this before we get into the real nitty-gritty?
I do not see any questions at this time. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to type them in to your message box, and I will read them off.
Thanks, Carrie. Okay, so we'll continue on. So we're going to drill down into some numbers. I know it's late in the day for math for a lot of you, and I'll do my best to talk it through in English rather than in numbers. The homestead tax rate. Homestead tax rates, and this is something that's really important to understand, they really don't reflect your total budget. They are based on education spending per equalized pupil. And one thing I failed to mention earlier about equalized pupils, for those of you who are new to this game, the notion of equalized pupil is, again, a state attempt at uniformity across districts when it comes to assessing the tax burdens for education. So students at different grade levels and different demographics are indexed differently. So, for example, an elementary student costs less to educate than a high school student. And so a high school student has a higher weighting to calculate this equalized pupil count. And because of these two statements that what the homestead tax rate really reflects is education spending and not your total budget, the current law requires that you present information to your taxpayers that specifically correlates your proposed budget to education spending per equalized pupil. So once you've worked through all your budget, and I'm guessing that most of you have encountered this already when you're developing your budgets, ultimately you have to look at it in a per pupil, per equalized pupil setting. And that's the comparison to make from last year to keep it really relevant to the tax rate changes. So the local tax rate for homesteads is the education spending total, that's your budget, right? The budgeted expenses minus revenues, divided by the equalized number of pupils in your district, which is provided to you by the state, divided by the property dollar equivalent yield. So if you are spending more than that yield per student of $10,666, your tax rate is going to be higher than the $1. If you are spending exactly that yield, then per student, then you're going to have a tax rate of $1. If you translate that education tax that we just calculated above by the common level of appraisal, the CLA, and you multiply that times your homestead's assessed value, that is the value that shows up on your tax bill that's on the grand list in your town, you divide that number by 100 because the tax rate is applied to every $100 value of home. So here's a kicker. For those of you who are in districts that cross town borders, the tax rates within your district are very likely to vary by town because the different towns may be subject to different common levels of appraisal, meaning that houses in town A are selling closer to the assessed values, to the grand list values, than the homes in town B, and that can be up or down. So another little wrinkle, if you are preparing a district presentation, I encourage you to show your taxpayers what the tax rates break down to by town. Okay, that was a lot of gibberish, right? So here we'll put some real numbers to it. If your education spending is almost 5.5 million, you've got 372.94 equalized pupils, and your property value dollar yield is the 10,666, then this is your calculation. Your tax rate is your spending divided by your equalized pupils divided by your property value yield. So in this case, in District A, this is a fabricated district with some fabricated numbers, your tax rate would be $1.3779 per $100 of assessed value of your home. So let's put that into real numbers again. And what is this household paying for taxes? Well, if the local homestead tax rate of that 1.3779 is divided by your CLA that's provided by the tax department and multiplied by your homestead appraisal, and I apologize, I just see an inconsistency again on this slide, which I will correct before we send them out. So let's say that your homestead appraisal is really $239,465. That would yield a tax bill for education of $3,330.56 for the year. And I believe most Vermont towns are splitting that into thirds, so you have 3 payments over the course of a year. Okay, got it? Are there questions about that calculation or anything having to do with homestead tax rates?
I see no questions at this time.
Well, we're just cooking here. Okay, I'll continue after I take a drink of water. But please don't hesitate to jump in with questions because it's going to get a little more complicated now.
A little more complicated.
Exactly. So now we're going to talk about income adjustments. As you probably are aware, not all Vermonters are paying based on the value of their homestead. In fact, 70%, over 70% of Vermont households are paying education taxes based on income rather than the assessed value of their homes. And you see this quote down here, and it's the 2017 statistics, but the threshold has remained the same since then, although it is subject to change. So households with less than $140,000 income, combined household income, are eligible for property tax adjustment. And they pay their taxes based on income rather than the assessed value. Okay, so what does that look like? The income adjusted tax rate is the same education spending per equalized pupil divided by the income dollar equivalent yield. That's different than the property dollar equivalent yield. And as I mentioned earlier, the base rate for the income is 2% of your income. So this is the basic formula to calculate the rate. And the liability, what the household actually is going to pay, is taking that rate and multiplying it by household income. So again, I'm going to go back for a second. If your spending per pupil is above the income dollar equivalent yield, you're going to be paying more than 2%. And if it is exactly the equivalent yield, you will be paying 2%. And this year, as the statistics show up above, that rate is $13,104 per equalized pupil. So again, let's put some real numbers to this. We're going to use the same school district, so the same education spending and the same equalized pupils, but we're going to use the income yield now instead of the value of the property. So if you take your spending per pupil, divide it by your income yield, and then you have to multiply that by that base tax rate of 2%, your income adjusted tax rate becomes 2.2418% of household income. So what does that look like for taxes? Well, it means that your tax liability is that tax rate times your household income. I've used an example here of $65,000, which leaves this tax bill at $1,457.17. And again, that's for the year. It's important to understand, for you to understand, that that amount of liability actually shows up as an adjustment to next year's tax bill. So what the tax department will actually do is calculate the household taxes based on the homestead rate, calculate what the income adjusted rate is, and give a credit for the difference, so that this is the bill that the taxpayer will see for next year, because this year's tax bills are already out.
Susan, we have a question.
Yes, by all means.
Carrie would like to know, is the percentage of people paying based on income available by town? And if so, where?
I believe it is, and I don't have that resource at my fingertips, but I will send that. It's probably going to be a link to that information at the tax department, and I will send that out when we send out the packet following up the webinar. Anything else?
That's our only question at this time.
Boy, either I'm doing a really good job or you guys are just deers in headlights with a lot of numbers coming at you. I can't see you, so I don't know which one. Okay, so we have a lot of uncertainty around us this year. Some districts more than others. Those that have Act 46 issues hanging on, whether it's part of the lawsuit, waiting for the legislative, although I guess today there was legislation, the House passed a bill, now it has to go to the Senate. So there are a lot of unknowns. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the numbers get adjusted after town meeting day. So we recommend for town meeting presentations, and I use that again at your district annual meetings, that you rely on the current law the way it is now, which means that you're going to project tax implications of your budget based on the current funding formula and the best available information at the time. And that's the December 1st letter and these formulas that we're showing off tonight. We also have a video resource. I'll hit on that in a minute. And also, we want to make sure that you realize, and that your townspeople realize, that there are some factors that you can control locally and others that you simply cannot, because they are calculations that are done based on data outside of your actual education spend, like your common level of appraisal, which has to do with real estate values in your town, or the number of equalized pupils in your district. You really have very little control over that. And whoever walks in the doors coming to your school district. So focus on these things. Your spending per student is critical, because that's a number that your taxpayers see. It's very transparent now, and it's the basis for all of the tax calculations. But a lot of things, of course, go into that, and you can highlight these things as well. Your staffing ratios, if you've been and completed collective bargaining, what those outcomes were and how they're influencing your overall budget, which of course translates to spending per student. Your district size and governance, and again, I don't want to harp on this because I know for a lot of districts that's been a hot button, but in other cases, there have been a lot of districts reporting great efficiencies from consolidations, and so they have a story to tell. Talk about the programs and services that you're offering and what's succeeding, and whatever facility investments you have made or are planning should also go in there. And we really encourage you, generally speaking, you will have your local legislators in attendance. Turn it over to them if there are questions about the law or some of the state calculations that really are not school board material. Does that make sense?
It does. We do have a couple of questions.
Great.
Okay, Russell wants to know, are there limits to property values to which the income formula is applied?
You know, that was something that was being thrown around last year in legislature. I don't believe that any of that passed. We may see it come up again as the legislators are trying to simplify and improve the tax formulas. But at the moment, I do not believe. I will verify that, but I don't think so.
And he did follow that up by saying, if so, can you explain the impact of the limits?
Again, I sort of at a loss here. I'm not well versed on that because I don't think that it is in play at the moment. I will provide a more thorough answer in the follow-up packet. Anything else, Carrie?
Not right now, thanks.
Okay. And I mentioned we do have this video. If you've not seen it, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's really a recitation of what we've just been through, giving some real life examples. And the numbers are a year out of date because it was made a year ago, but the formulas are still relevant. And we encourage you to show it to your taxpayers, to your voters at your budget meeting, if that's appropriate, or else to share one of these links with them. As I mentioned earlier, it's either on our website or on our YouTube channel. You can access it either place. It walks you through how Dick and Jane calculate their taxes and why, although they're in the same supervisory district, they have different tax rates because they live in different towns. It demonstrates their parents who are paying based on income, and also their parents' friends who are retired and only part-time residents. So it really walks you through the range of possible demographics that influence the tax rates. I want to take a second too to let you know that with the packet that we're going to be sending along, we are giving you a packet of templates that include a couple of things. First of all, an Excel spreadsheet that is pre-populated with the formulas. So it's really designed to help you understand the mechanics of the formulas. You can plug in your own numbers and either use that as a tool for your presentation or at least for your own edification to feel more comfortable with the numbers and the formulas, because they are really complicated. When I last sat on school board, there was one man on the school board who actually understood the formula out of 6 of us. And I think that's not uncommon. And a lot of times it's the business manager, not even a board member. So it's important that you understand the impact that these decisions are having on your voters, particularly if you want their support for the budget. Also in that packet is a template of a PowerPoint presentation, which you are invited to use wholesale or take parts of as you're putting together your own presentation for your district meeting. It kind of walks through the successes and the challenges that you're facing as a board, to highlight the ways that you've accomplished your goals, to address issues that need correction, and then to launch into the numbers with comparisons from the current year, both in terms of budget dollars, significant line items, as well as what that translates to in taxes, because the yields have changed this year, and so right there will be a difference. Okay, last chance for questions. Anything that we've covered tonight or anything in your budget presentations in general that I can offer a little bit more insights on?
There are no questions right now, Susan.
Okay, well, you are all welcome to contact me anytime. Here's my contact information. If things come up after the fact, I'd love to hear from you. I invite you to join us again for the next of our first Thursday webinars, which will be on the board chair. We title it Board Chair 101. It's really a wonderful overview of what the job of a board chair is, in case you're thinking of running for board chair, or you're just needing to decide who you're going to vote for your board chair. It gives a pretty comprehensive view of what that job entails. And so I hope and believe that will be informational for all of you. I mentioned before, we will be, when we close out this webinar, you'll have a brief survey link. I beg you, I implore you to please take advantage of that so that we can have your feedback. And if you need to reach any of us at VSBA, here we all are. This time of year, getting hold of Nicole Mace and Sue Siglowski is always sort of a challenge because they are mostly over at the State House involved in advocacy and public policy, but they are always reachable by email, as am I and Carrie. We are in the office more than we're not, so give us a call if you have any questions or concerns or issues that you need to raise.
We have
Thank you again.
Susan,
oh, good.
We have one question.
Yep.
Terry would like to know what you suggest to do with hecklers.
Great question, Terry. I think that the most important thing you can do is stick to the current laws. Generally, I believe the hecklers are going to come out if they don't like what's going on in legislature, and you're not responsible for that. Now, if somebody's telling you that they don't like that you're increasing your athletic budget by 10% because they think that it ought to be in the math, well, you're going to need to have a little bit of an answer for that. Generally speaking, I encourage you to avoid that level of detail in the presentation. They your taxpayers will have access to it, of course, in your annual report. So it is possible that those kinds of questions come up. But I think most of them are really more about what are you doing to combat this, or how come our student numbers are down so low, forcing our spending per pupil up. And those really aren't issues that you have any control over. And I think you need to be really clear about that.
All right. Thanks, Susan.
Okay, well, thank you, Carrie, and thank you all for giving us some time this evening. Stay off the roads. I hear it's pretty icy out there. I know I was stuck last night. Don't wish that on anybody. Have a good evening.